All right, well, shall we get started, Ryan? Over
We
to you.
shall,
Yeah.
absolutely. So welcome everybody. I am so pleased to invite you all to our fall speaker series. And today we're going to be joined by Dr. Benjamin Sovacool, who is just such a such a prolific figure in our field of energy social sciences, energy geography. But Dr. Sovacool is the director of Boston University's Institute for Global Sustainability and a professor in the Department of Earth and Environment. He's also the editor-in-chief for a journal that many of us publish in, the Energy Research and Social Sciences. Um, Dr. Sovacool also has obtained research grants amounting to $28 million. A lot of his research focuses on um, global energy and climate policy and justice, but really like spanning the whole swath of energy and climate studies. Um, Dr. Sovacool and I have teamed up for a project. I've had the great pleasure of working with Benjamin over the last couple of years on a project looking at whole systems energy injustices for solar development in India. And we have published three papers on this project. And Benjamin is here today to talk about something that many of us grapple with in academia, and that is failure and rejection. Um, and for someone as successful as Benjamin, I think it will surprise you to learn that even Benjamin is faced with rejection and failure at some points in his career. So, as the chair of the Energy and Environment Specialty Group of AAG, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Benjamin Sovacool to give this talk today. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome, Dr. Stock. It's a pleasure to be here. And a bit of an odd topic. And just to be totally fair, Ryan asked me to choose the topic, and I chose this one. But I chose it because I think it's something that is really widespread, ubiquitous in academia, and also something that I think we need to destigmatize. We have a lot of students, especially when they get their first rejection, that become depressed, and some even leave the field because I think they think they've already failed. And I wanted to kind of destigmatize this, open it up, and let everyone know that actually coping with failure and rejection is something everyone deals with, actually all the time. I am now such a productive scholar that I'm probably rejected every week. In fact, I was just rejected yesterday, as it goes. So that's kind of the rationale for today's presentation, right? Success rates for papers, grant proposals, job applications range from less than 1%, that's your Nature and your Science and some NSF, National Science Foundation divisions, to 25%. But even that 25% range means 3 out of 4 are rejected, depending on the kind of publisher and the scheme. So that does mean that already the default is the chances of rejection are very high. Many, many excellent and fundable papers and proposals are often rejected, even those with perfect reviewer scores, because there's not enough funding to go around, and research councils have to make and break ties. And I couldn't believe it. I can't tell you their name because it's confidential. I just had a colleague win a grant, as in they were eligible for funding, but didn't get it because they had so many people who won, it went to a lottery, and a computer randomly chose who got the money. Can you imagine? You do everything right, get good peer reviews, but because they had too many proposals that were excellent, it was a lottery of who decided who got it and who didn't. Yet, as we all know, Ryan and I still cringe over some of our rejections. They are bruising and painful. And in fact, I'm still emotionally scarred. Maybe I have PTSD from some of the really worst rejections that I've had that were just really gut wrenching. And I'm a bit older than many of you, with less hair and a bigger waistband. But to start, I don't like these two slides, but they kind of help. As Ryan said, I'm someone who's had a bit of luck of being somewhat successful in academia. And as Aristotle used to say, to be persuasive, you need logos, ethos, and pathos. One of those three is credibility. So I wanted to just give you a quick sense for who I am, in case you don't have the pleasure like Ryan of having met me before. So I'm a researcher who does a lot of work on energy, justice, and climate policy. Although my PhD is in a weird field called science and technology studies, which is why almost all my examples today are from energy and climate journals and spaces, but I think it still applies equally well to other disciplines, other sectors like geography or sustainability or water or land use. I've also been lucky enough to author and edit more than 20 books. So I'm also getting to see rejections of book proposals. I've also written lots of articles, picked up lots of citations. And this is neat too. I've worked with more than 170 students, often where they lead as the first lead authors, as well as 3 books that I actually co-wrote with students as well. So I write a lot. I also, as Ryan said, am the editor-in-chief of a journal, and I am what's called a reader for many presses and a peer reviewer for many journals. So this is really neat because it means that I'm able to see rejection from 3 different dimensions: as an author, as a reviewer, and as an editor. That said, of course, today I'm not speaking on behalf of any of the people that I work for or with. It's entirely my views as Benjamin Sovacool, so I'm speaking only in my personal capacity. So I wanted to start, this is today's talk, which is designed to be about 30 minutes or so. So there'll be lots of time for questions and answers and commiseration, right? Because a lot of people actually like to maybe share experiences about rejection because it makes it easier to bear and to tolerate. So when I look over my career, someone once said, what are the different types of rejection? And actually there are 4 big ways that you can suffer rejection in academia. The one that we talk about already, that Ryan talked about a lot, is the failure to publish. But that isn't the only type of failure we have to grapple with. There's also the failure to correct mistakes in work you've already published, which sucks because that could involve retractions, corrigendums, or embarrassment publicly because what you've said is now written down so that others can see it. Another problem that affects up to maybe 50% of papers is a failure to be cited and used. So you do all this wonderful work and then no one reads it. And finally, a failure to be funded, which is just as brutal, perhaps more, than failure to publish because grants are the engine by which you generate publications. So if you're not getting the grants, you're not even lucky enough to be rejected from the articles that the grants would have produced. And then I'll end with just a few tips about how to handle rejection perhaps better, or at least maybe prepare for rejection, and some tips about maybe how to socialize rejection, like have rejection parties, things like that, which we do at some of the universities. So, all right, failure to publish. Let's begin. There are many, many bad peer reviewers out there. There's even a blog or a Twitter thing called Reviewer Number 2, right, which makes jokes about that horrible reviewer. And get this, at Elsevier, which is the world's biggest publisher, not the best, but the biggest, the rejection rate is 82%. The average article submitted to an Elsevier journal, which includes a host of geography journals, Geoforum, Political Geography, Economic Geography, these are all Elsevier journals, as well as Energy Policy, Applied Energy, Renewable Sustainable Energy Reviews. I'll go on and on and on, but I won't. 82% are rejected the first time they're submitted. And keep in mind that number of 82% is not just for Ryan Stock. It is also for Nobel laureates, lab directors, full professors, and people with 50 years of experience, right? So that also indicates that you should flip your mind at the start to expect rejection. That's what the odds say. And here are just some examples of horrid peer reviews that I've had. I kid you not, Dr. Stock. One peer review that I had was 1 word, and the word was no. And it was upheld. I appealed that review to the editor, and it was upheld. There was another review we had actually on gender and energy where we really ticked off a male author who identified as male, and their review, the article was 12,000 words long. Their review was 15,000 words. 15,000 word review. There was one review that got halfway through the paper, and here is the review. I'm going off to dinner. Remember to get back to this later. Well, they didn't, and they submitted a half review. I've also had profanity used at me in reviews. I've been called an eco-Nazi for my stance on nuclear power, and I've had the F-bomb dropped in 11 reviews, which also gives an indication of people who are being inappropriate. And then, I kid you not, we had another piece that was criticizing the Asian Development Bank for not appreciating gender, and they sent it to the head of the ADB, who categorically dismissed our article as having no relevance to the ADB's mission, which kind of proved our point about gender bias, but also was a huge conflict of interest. If you're critiquing an entity, they shouldn't be the sole gatekeeper by which they proceed to peer review. And let's not call out just reviewers here. We've also had a host of bad editors, and I won't go into these in detail. But yes, editors who forget to send it for review, editors who didn't realize it was submitted, editors who didn't realize reviews were in, or in two tragic cases, I made it all the way through the end of the peer review process. So submission, peer review, revision, re-review, revision again, except with minor revisions, revised again, it should be accept now, only to have the paper rejected. And in two of those cases, you may be like, how did that happen? Well, in one case, the editor handling the paper died, and the new editor came in and was like, this qualitative article, I don't like it. And in the other case, it was an article, Mike Pasqualetti will appreciate this, about the co-benefits of offshore wind energy. And the editor had just had a dinner the night before about how offshore wind could devalue his coastal property. And he didn't want to publish pieces that were pro-wind. So there's two examples of complete editorial bias that were not even overridden after appeal. And you also have editorial gaming situations where editors will say, you must cite my journal 6 times, or even worse, you must cite me 6 times before I let you pass to peer review. That's the first type of rejection. The second type deals with you've managed to navigate this treacherous quagmire of peer review, and then you find that you have mistakes in your published work. And if lucky, you get to issue a core addendum. And if the mistakes are serious enough, you probably should self-retract the paper. And if they're especially serious, the paper will be retracted without your actual consent. And this can be relatively simple stuff. Like in this particular one, I think we said in this article that Denmark has lowest energy consumption per capita, except in this case, it was supposed to be per unit of economic growth. Okay, easy mistake to make, but it was technically incorrect. Here's another example of where we just transposed the wrong number in a table, right, which then changed one of the subsets of table 2. Here's another one that's a little more painful, where I put the wrong table in from a report. Oops. Two more serious ones where we were making false claims about smart meters needing broadband connections. Actually, it wasn't broadband connections. It was actually digital connections. There's a difference there between the two, which mattered meaningfully for the ways that we talked about the exclusion of access to smart meters. And then in one really painful situation, we have self-retracted a paper published in Climate Policy, which is a legitimate journal, led by my colleague Andrew Lawrence, and published with my close colleague at SPRU, Professor Andy Sterling. And this was particularly painful because it was a really good article, but it turns out that Andrew Lawrence, when he transposed data from one of the tables from a report, he didn't do it right in Excel, and it jumbled the numbers. So the table was meaningless, in which case all of our results, and this is what was weird, is that the data transcription error looked legit, as in the data made sense to us. It showed patterns that we thought that we would see, and therefore we actually did self-retract the article, published a statement of withdrawal on Retraction Watch, and even referred ourselves to our university for investigation for misconduct, which was dismissed. But this was kind of how far we took it to let people know we made a mistake, we're very sorry. It was really only that, it was just a mistake. There was never an intent to deceive. And another way of doing this is kind of failure to anticipate what response your work might have. And so I've kind of demoralized. James Hansen from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is a huge luminary to me. And he has now gone off against me publicly over our stance on nuclear power. He's convinced it's a great low carbon solution. We're convinced it's not, given nuclear waste, nuclear accidents, cost overruns, et cetera, right? And he comes out, really harsh and really tries to debunk us in this article in Environmental Science and Technology. And perhaps my favorite example is where we ticked off the US Department of Energy, their chief modeler, in an article we had peer-reviewed in the journal Energy about bias in Energy Information Administration forecasts about renewable energy, which go into NEMS, the National Energy Modeling Simulation, where we showed that they don't forecast wind, bioenergy, and solar well at all. And they demanded the article be retracted. The journal assessed our article, assessed the quality of review, and upheld the publication. Hurrah! So then they were pissed off and wrote a working paper, which is called In on Accuracies in a Published Journal Article, written by the chief energy analysts at the US Department of Energy. This, in a way, can also be fun if you have that type of personality, or exhausting and stressful. Academia is weird in that the more that you tick people off and the more they take you seriously, the more you'll see commentary like this. And sometimes it hurts. Sometimes it isn't people reading from the energy office that you criticize. This is an example of a published paper of ours where we were criticized by our colleagues from UCL. We were at Sussex. We were an hour away. They could have just come to our office and sat down and had a chat. Instead, they published an open letter to the editors of Energy Policy arguing that our article should be withdrawn for 8 pages of basically arguments. And we got to write a rebuttal, which was longer. So we found more flaws in their critique than they found in us. And I'm delighted to say that if the editors upheld our publication there, and we did make up with our colleagues at UCL and had an exchange of correspondences in the journal about many of these issues. But this is just a kind of, you should learn to anticipate these a bit better, right? If you're criticizing the Asian Development Bank or the Department of Energy, think through what will happen if they read this, and then be prepared to potentially handle these types of debates, which can be quite stressful. Similarly, with an article we had on nuclear power published in Nature Energy, which is by no means easy to publish in, where colleagues, like Jesse Jenkins at Princeton, have, tweeted, by the way, factually wrong, that matters arising are only when flaws in prior papers arise. No, matters arising are when something of interest arises. When there's flaws, you retract, you idiot. But anyway, you can tell I'm still pissed off about this. Another example of where you get into these really good debates, some of them legitimate, about assumptions in your study and about the implications of what might really matter. And 109 people liked his tweet, by the way. But anyway, that's beside the point. Lastly, it's not lastly, second to last, there is the failure to be cited. Now, there is debate here about how bad this is. I found this tweet from 2024 that half of academic papers are never read by anyone other than authors, peer reviewers, and journal editors. I think that's a bit high. I've actually seen some good bibliometric stuff that says it's more about 10% to 20%. But even if it's 20%, 1 out of 5 academic papers are not read by anyone. And that's really, really demoralizing because, as was indicated, 82% of papers are rejected. So it is a marathon carrying an article from submission to publication. And a lot of us think these articles are like a fish. Once you publish it, that fish is released right into the sea and it swims around and gets caught by everyone who wants to eat it. That's not the case at all. Many times, promoting your work, getting it cited, getting it used by policymakers or the media is as much work as publishing. And this is an admitted area where I'm horrible at it. It's why I have a director of communications here at Boston University who does it for me. That makes sure that they get it into the hands of those that will use it. And I have a huge, disgusting, fat tail of uncited works. Yes, I've published hundreds of articles, but 75 of them, Ryan, 75 have never been cited once? Even by me. I could fix this tomorrow if I wanted to. And gosh, look at the second one on this thing. That energy security 6-volume set is a 2,300-page volume that not even someone cited once. And there is no necessary connection here to rigor or quality. That energy access report for Myanmar was the first done at the national level, and that article in the bottom on China involved a mixed methods research design of community interviews, focus groups, and a survey, all done throughout many rural provinces of China. No citations, right? And so again, this can also be something that will happen to all of us. There is no direct correlation between what you think will be cited and what isn't cited. And lastly, let's not forget a failure to win grants and be funded. I have now, I was calculating this last week, been a principal investigator or a co-investigator or a research collaborator on more than 250 proposals over 15 years, which means I'm also on this treadmill of proposals, just like a treadmill of articles. So that works out to be about 12 a year or one a month. Now, thank goodness I'm not leading those all as PI. And I'm happy to disclose now publicly on the record, Ryan is recording this, my success rate is 20%. Gosh, that's really close to that 82% rejection rate from Elsevier. But this is actually still higher than the average for the Economic and Social Research Council in the UK. That's about, I think, 18%. But it's lower than both the institutional averages of my homes at Sussex and Boston. Sussex's is about a 30% success rate, so 1 out of 3, and I hear Boston's is 35%, which may imply either luck or more selectivity or a lower volume of grants. And again, grant proposals can be rejected for all sorts of silly reasons similar to articles, including having proposals now twice with perfect reviewer scores that are still downgraded by the assessors and not funded, yet they still funded proposals that did not have perfect reviewer scores. How do I know that? Because I asked, and they disclosed. The other colleagues who won the grant showed me their peer reviews. That's not fair. But it could be that they already had redundant publications or submissions, or it could be they wanted geographic, they had too many proposals for the South, they wanted to fund the North or the East or the West, or maybe, Ryan, they wanted to fund minority institutions, or they wanted more women PIs, which are all laudable goals, right? So you could also find other ways beyond peer review to downgrade. This was really brutal, and I think Professor Pasqualetti may remember 20 years ago when the federal government went through a freeze on their funding. So we had just won at Vermont Law School a $35 million grant for energy efficiency. Contract was signed, money's about to come, and then it was stripped out of the federal budget by the budget freeze. We did everything right, had won it. Massive 7 or 8 figure grant, only not to get it. And you'll like this one, both of you. Someone gave us a 0 score on a proposal because interviews, merely talking to people, is not an established method. You need a model. That's a verbatim quote from the 0 out of 7 review that we got, which was also upheld by the Research Council, which dismisses a whole body of knowledge: anthropology, ethnography, sociology, political science, STS, history, geography, and so forth. Right, so now we move to the last bit, which means now you need to prepare for rejection. Elinor Ostrom, the Nobel laureate, here you see, in a wonderful outfit. The only person who would look better in that is Mike Pasqualetti. Used to tell me,
No, no.
expect rejection. The more innovative your work, the more that it challenges a community or fills a gap, that might be why the more innovative papers are rejected. And she shared with me, look at this. When she first applied for a PhD in economics, she was turned away. And she ended up winning the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences. And she told me, when I got the pleasure of having dinner with her once, that the paper mentioned in her Nobel citation had been rejected 5 times. 5 times. If she hadn't tried that 6th time, who knows what might have happened? And my own most highly cited single authored paper called What Are We Doing Here was also rejected 5 times, right? So sometimes the rejections are wrong, not you. And I'm good colleagues as well as with Ben Martin, who is the senior editor at Research Policy, which is another top tier journal. And he was going through the top, I think, 500 articles of their history over 50 years that had been the most highly cited. And Ben said in almost every single case of those excellent articles, there was one peer reviewer recommending reject up until the end that had to be overruled by an editor. So the editor's job is not to just spit the peer reviews to you. The editor must overrule and arbitrate, or else good papers won't make it through, which is a great lesson that most editors actually don't do. So I think it's very telling that novelty and innovation could actually generate the very rejection that they shouldn't. It's also very telling that publishing and writing proposals is a numbers game, kind of like winning the lottery or maybe finding the best pizza. I've had some of the worst papers of mine accepted without most revisions, and I've had some of the best papers rejected by multiple journals. And I don't recommend this. I'm going to give some context here. I did take the same article, which was rejected, not do a single thing to it, and submit it to another journal, which is generally bad practice. You should try to accommodate the peer reviewer comments. Why did I do this? Because the reject came in while I was at the airport for a 4-month vacation to Borneo. Why not? I got nothing to lose. I got 4 months where I'm not going to be at a computer. Let's just see what happens. So I'm happy to say the paper was rejected with 3 reports by Energy Policy. So I sent it to Energy, which 10 years ago was kind of like the same as Energy Policy. And I couldn't believe it. I got back from my trip to Borneo. It'd been accepted with 3 reports. How can the same paper get 3 rejects and 3 accepts at the same sorts of journals? That, if nothing else, really shows you sometimes it is a numbers game and it is purely about chance or luck or unluck. And I want to share with you some quotes. This is Michael Jordan. He's a basketball player, for those of you in Europe that may not know what basketball is. Look at this. He's missed more than 9,000 shots in his career. 26 times he's been trusted to take the game-winning shot and missed. He's failed over and over and over again, and that's why he succeeds. And if you don't like sports, how about Winston Churchill? Success is stumbling from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm. Or if you don't like Churchill because he's an alcoholic, what about Abraham Lincoln? He failed running for Senate. He failed running for Senate. He failed running for Senate, and then he won running for Senate, and then he won the presidency. And these are not just 3 anecdotal examples that I've chosen of men. Check this out. Einstein, his parents thought he was subnormal, and he was expelled from school for being mentally slow. Michael Jordan was cut from his basketball team for lack of skill, right? Bill Gates was a dropout, and his first business, Trough Data, was a failure. Thomas Edison's teachers told him he was too stupid to learn anything. Up there on the right, I believe, is Stephen King, right? 30 years he was depressed and removed, and that's Steve Jobs. He was removed from the company he started. Oprah Winfrey was told she was unfit for TV. The Beatles were told they have no future in show business. Oops. Who is that? Is that Marilyn Monroe was dropped because she was told she wasn't pretty enough. Let's see, Sigmund Freud was fired for having no original ideas. Henry Ford was a failure at 3 businesses. Gosh, the founder of KFC couldn't sell his chicken. Stephen King's book was rejected 30 times. Honda was passed over for an engineering job at Toyota. And my favorite, J.K. Rowling, right, was unemployed and divorced and wrote Harry Potter from a coffee shop. Right, so this is a great example of many of our biggest successes who are telling us how they really had to learn about grappling with failure before they could succeed. Which means we ought to prepare for rejection and criticism. Now, I will tell you with my experience, the more that you write proposals, the more that you write blogs, the more that you try to do outreach, and the more that you write grants, it's the easier that it gets. It is like building a muscle or learning to ride a bicycle or a new instrument. And I do like Malcolm Gladwell's rule. If you spend 10,000 hours at anything, surgery, jazz, painting, DJing, you'll tend to get pretty darn good at it. And I do think that is very, very true with publishing. So the more you do it, the better it is. As I said earlier with those examples, sometimes the more people criticize you, the more they think you're worth engaging with. And in a way, that's a sign of success. If they don't think, because writing a 15,000 word peer review takes a month, right? So we really had to motivate, for lack of a better term, that person to do it. And I think it's interesting that kind of all successes have a kind of common element, but every failure is unique. I think that's a kind of a quip from Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, and I've had, grant proposals or papers that were excellent but went to the wrong editor. Or they went to the right editor but had a poor editorial screening process. So they passed the editor but had the wrong peer reviewers. So they got the right peer reviewers and the wrong editorial decision. It's like a ladder, a hierarchy, a nested hierarchy of ways that any one of these elements can create failure. but you need all of them for success, like an airplane crash. And all in all, Ryan, here it is. You are incorrect that I have been more successful than not. I have now been rejected, if you count peer-reviewed articles, grant proposals, op-eds, and I think I threw in job applications. I have been rejected 2,156 times, and I'm still in my 40s, just for the record, even though I probably don't look it. So what tips do I have, given that we all have to navigate this sea of rejection and depravity? It is a game of numbers, so even the ESRC has noted researchers who apply infrequently have lower success than those that apply more frequently. The rhythm and tempo can be soul-eating. I'm just being brutally honest here. My worst streak at Sussex, where I was director of the energy group, professor of energy policy, and director of the Center on Innovation and Energy Demand, which had Oxford, Manchester, and Sussex together. I went on a 0 for 21 streak for proposals. It was a year and a half. 0 for 21. Not one. I was like, what am I doing wrong? Only to then go 10 for 11. Which is also like, shouldn't happen. 95% success rate, right? Including many of those proposals that had been rejected before. And the wins here were even big. The rejection was an ESRC 1 for 1 million, ESRC 1 for 2 million. I'm like, let's go for 10. And we won it. Center bid for 5 million, center bid for 6 million. Let's go for 40 million. And we won it. So again, imagine if I had given up, I never would have learned and gotten the feedback I needed. And I never also would have had the other odds flip around to then have a huge success rate. In the same way that Stephen King's book was rejected 30 times, Carrie, before it was accepted the 31st time. Now, successful grant holders have often received rejections for bids that are funded elsewhere, even at the same funder, which also lets you know sometimes how arbitrary that peer review process can be. And if you like to read Angela Duckworth, research does show that grit pays off, right? This isn't talent, it isn't innate ability, but it's your passion, perseverance for achieving your long-term goals. And unfortunately, some of that can't be taught. You either have it or you don't. Another tip I really have is mentoring, and I think Professor Pasqualetti knows my mentor, Richard Hirsch at Virginia Tech. There's a photo of us and him as well, where I had a lot more hair. Find good mentors. Richard, and actually Professor Pasqualetti has been a mentor of mine as well, so has Marilyn Brown. There are many successful people that you can learn from, and they usually like to talk about themselves. Which means that you can extract knowledge from them, right? Which is good. You can also change the system from within. Offer to peer review for the journal that just rejected for you. Or better yet, take the journals you want to publish in and write to the editors right now. I am delighted at Energy Research and Social Science when I get an email, I get 2 or 3 a week. Dear sir, I would like to review for your journal. Great! I'll send 5 your way, right? We love this. And it also means you'll start to learn and see other reviewers' scores and assessments, and also see the quality or the sub-quality of what's in the peer review cycle. Also find opportunities to become editors yourself. I think both Professors Pasqualetti and Dr. Stock are on my board of ERSS. And again, the usually gateway is you start as a peer reviewer, and then you can move up to the editorial board, or better yet, an associate editor or editor-in-chief. And these are all temporary. For instance, I'm actually rotating off of ERSS in 2 more years because I've reached my limit at Elsevier, right? So there are usually slots that are opening up at many of these journals. And there are some weird things like environmental politics and research policy. We're both looking for a chief editor for years. They couldn't find someone willing to do it, right? So you'd be surprised at the opportunities that may exist for you if you do want to become editors. And then this is key. Review for grants. First of all, you get to see proposals. And NSF, I've now done this 5 times, you don't just read 2, I had to read 30. Now imagine, okay, the work, but also imagine the skill. I just saw 30 proposals, and I could see the 3 that are funded, and the others that are close, and those that are not, and how much you learn from doing one cycle of that. And also, once you have a bit of experience there, serve on panels. because the panels are those who are evaluating the reviewer scores to make the actual decisions. And again, you'd be amazed. I'm asked to be on a panel every week, and I say no 50 times a year. And so there's all these open slots on panels because people don't have the time to do it. So again, if you volunteer to serve on a panel for NSF or AAG or others, my guess is that they will usually say yes. And this is a nice way, if you want to. Some reviewers use this as a chance to take out their angst on others, but you can also be the change you want to see. Be kind, be gracious, give good proposals perfect scores, and no criticism. You're allowed to do that, right? So you could be kind and the sort of reviewer you wish you could see in the world, which can create a virtuous cycle. You treat these authors well, and then when they peer review, they may do the same as they learn, rather than all this destructive criticism. So really, flip your mental attitude, right? Expect rejection, 82% for articles, 80% for grants. That way, you'll be amazed when you succeed rather than constantly depressed that you didn't. Be the change you want to see as a peer reviewer or a grant reviewer, and try to generate a thick skin. And maybe generate coping strategies. For instance, I have decoupled email from my phone. Otherwise, every dinner I've had out with my parents or a partner is like a rejection came in. And then I'm upset for the rest of the evening, right? So I don't do it anymore. I will not let email interfere with my consumption of a nice IPA or eating sushi, right? And I think being able to have a thick skin and to persevere and to be confident might be the single most important factor that explains my own productivity. Not intelligence, not talent, not training, just getting on with it. And lastly, having spaces to commiserate helps. Like I said, we often every Friday at University of Sussex would have once a month a rejection party where we'd each have a pint and talk about rejections. It really helped us all feel better, and everyone had something to say. And also, humor helps. For instance, Ryan, we've seen this before. This is what your meal looks like when you incorporate all of the critiques. Thank you for laughing. Or this one. This is the new streamlined peer review process as quite an improvement. And if you've got eyes, there's death waiting before you see the paper get accepted. And then lastly, I've got one more, and this is for all of us who have PhDs. It says here you should go to hell, but since you already have a PhD, we'll count that as time served. So again, it's okay to laugh and to share experiences and to recognize we're all in this together, so let's make the most of it. And with that, Ryan, I'm ready for questions.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. That was an extremely helpful talk for me personally. I'm somebody that struggles to accept rejection and failure, as many of us, I'm sure, are. And you have served as a mentor for me, somebody that I aspire to be more like in my career, and somebody that has helped me through in my research trajectory and my professional trajectory over the last couple of years for certain. And I think you're right. By expecting rejection, you're not as surprised when it happens, right? And you can learn from that. I think that is one of the main takeaways from your talk. I was talking with you before we started your presentation that even papers that we've written together were rejected at first, maybe a couple times. Nature Communications is a journal, not to name and shame, but they sat on our paper for about 2 years, I think, year and a half maybe, before we eventually had to pull it. And they made us jump through a lot of hoops during that time. And every time we accommodated their requests and edited the article accordingly. And still, with no publication in sight, it was just death, basically. How many more times do you want to die with the same paper, basically? So thank you so much for your generous insights. Someone of your stature to be as humble enough to admit their rejection and failure was very refreshing. And I think I wish a lot of other scholars at your stage would be more open with that and more transparent.
And I'll give you two other little bits of feedback, Ryan. One is I do peer review about 40 or 50 times a year for journals because I try to, they kind of, you should at least try to review equal to what you submit. And actually some say you should review 2 or 3 times what you submit because what you submit needs 2 to 3 reviewers. Here's a little tip. I probably won't accept all the invitations, but I almost never suggest reject, right? Because a reject is just harsh, especially its publication is like the end of the line. Imagine starting the PhD, collecting the data, synthesizing the data, writing it, doing all of this work, years of work until it gets to the journal. And so, yeah, I think I am actually one of those peer reviewers, believe it or not, that and only rarely does reject. And I found this to be the case in the reviewer pool that the more senior people get, the more kind they often are. And some of the harshest, meanest reviews are early career scholars who maybe have been treated poorly by the system. In fact, first year postdocs seem to be the most toxic, just looking at anecdotally. So there is something really going on of like they just got their PhD and they think now's my chance to get back at everyone. And it's really, yeah, so it's kind of, they become the same thing that they criticize against. And also I'm good friends with Monica Contestable, who's the editor-in-chief of Nature Sustainability. And Nature Sustainability is a general journal that is very interdisciplinary. You've got social science work, economics work, physical sciences work. And we were at dinner one night, and she's like, "You social scientists are so hard on each other. Natural scientists are just like valid, check, 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 publish. You know, 2 pages,
Right.
done. And yet it's us who have like the 10-page reviews debating the use of Foucault, how would you use the word power rather than power relations,
Right.
what's prefigurative power versus restorative power, and we just create all this trouble for ourselves. She's like, what is up with that? Why do you do that to yourselves? Which is where I'm kind of getting out of like, we are in this community of rejection, but we are also agents that create that rejection. And that is something I think we should start changing soon as well.
Absolutely. We need to foster a culture of care, and kindness in our work.
Give people the benefit of the doubt, and good can be good enough, even if they don't cite your work. Anyway, there must be questions. Come on, turn on your camera and raise your hand, and I'll let Dr. Stock here moderate and choose who goes first.
See Emmanuel's hand up. Go ahead. I cannot hear you if you're speaking.
Hey, Emmanuel, we can't hear you. But we see the headphone coming on. That's a good sign. Oh, still no. Why don't you type it into
Can
the
I
chat?
jump in while you
Yeah.
try to work through your technical issues, Emmanuel?
Hey, Tom. Good to see you.
Hey. I think it's such an important topic. I think that we clearly deal with rejection more than success for most of us, and it's something that we are not really mentored on at a department level. It's the sort of thing that we just navigate ourselves, and I think it's something that we need to talk more about, right? It does impact us. It impacts our mental health and our feelings of worthiness. It impacts our scholarship. My question, I've got a couple, but my first one really is, and I'll let others go. Do you think there are some differences between journals and grants? And what I'm getting at here is that, I think at least with an article, you have a mechanism to challenge an outright rejection, or you get at least some sort of process to. Whereas with grants, it's either I've never heard of anyone challenging a rejection on a grant and having that decision overturned. And maybe this is something about, the reviewers, and there could be a lot of you get what you pay for here, that we're all doing that. these reviews, we're not being compensated for it. We're incredibly busy. And sometimes, as you know yourself, you get the worst of what you see in folks. So the bigger question here is, should for junior faculty anyway, be focusing more on what I would say is more of a meritocracy, which is an article. If you have a good product, there is at least a chance that you might, challenge the original decision or go somewhere else. But with grants, it tends to be a little bit of a black box. It's a yes or a no, and depending on the agency, you might get anything from some good feedback to sort of nothing at all.
No, that's very true, Tom. And I've never had a successful appeal for grants, even when there's outright bias or factual errors. Those are the only real grounds, or conflict of interest, that you could really go for a grant. I think we've had 4 or 5 appeals, and of course they've all been dismissed. And even some will say there is no chance to appeal. And one of them was quite severe. A colleague, there were 2 sentences for a rejection. This was an ERC grant. One was that the budget was way too high at X amount, and the other was that the PI had no training in field X. And their defense was that wasn't the budget. They were looking at someone else's budget, wasn't the right number, and that PI had exactly the PhD in that topic. So 2 factual errors that should never have justified rejection, and that is still upheld. So you are right about the kind of irreversibility of grant decisions. And irritatingly, there are even some schemes, British Academy gives no peer review feedback. You're rejected, you don't know why.
Right.
Papers aren't much better. I've had 21 appeals. I've been successful twice. So that gives you a sense of it's not that much better. Sure, there are the 2 times I was successful, but man, all that work and the letters and the appeals that you make, that really didn't go anywhere. It's just easier to resubmit somewhere else to another journal because we have so many options. So you are right there. I will only say one thing to add, which is that peer-reviewed paper reviews tend to be a little different than grant reviews in a few ways. Grant reviews usually have a score, whereas for peer review, it's usually like major revisions, minor revisions, or reject, right? So the range of which you can give scores is more for the grant reviews. That also means if you really want a grant to succeed, you've got to give it a very high score. Giving it a middle score is as good or as bad as a low score.
Yeah.
It also gives you what you need to tank a proposal. Give it a 0 and it's out. Even if it's with a ridiculous sentence like interview is not an appropriate method, 0, that will tank the proposal, which I guess is a huge problem with grant review.
You think compensation plays into it? Because a lot of the NSF boards, the committees, you likely be compensated for doing that work, where with journals, it tends to be, can you do this as a service?
You are not remunerated at NSF anywhere close to what it takes. And so, for instance, I was just on a panel. They remunerated me for the days I spent in the workshop, which was 4 hours a day for 2 days, not for the 30 proposals and the 60 hours I took to review the proposals. So it works out to be less than minimum wage, actually, for the intellectual work, if you're looking at it for remuneration. So of course you're not. But yeah, even there. And NSF has had no funding increases for 25 years, which means the amount of excellent research they can fund goes down each year. So you can still get an excellent rating, must be funded, and not get funded, which is a political issue, right? Because they need to up the funding for NSF rather than anything else. And so, yeah, I don't think compensation changes it per se, because it's still too low. Emmanuel, did we hear your microphone?
Yeah, maybe I can
working?
come back in.
Yes,
Is it clear
excellent.
now? Awesome. Thank you very much, Professor Sovacool, for your time and insights. Emmanuel speaking, early stage doctoral student here. And I've heard you speak at other platforms, and thank you always for sharing your wisdom. It's really useful to hear. I think even if I did not ask a question today, I think leaving with understanding that you've also had circumstances of failure, and many examples of failure, I think is really useful to hear and encouraging to hear. But thinking as a parent, I've got a 3.5-year-old child. I think what you want to do for a child, understanding how harsh the world is not to ask them to develop a thick skin or to be persistent or to have grit. What you want to do for a child at that early stage is create an environment that supports. Even at times when the child is failing, you want to be positive and enthusiastic and sort of cheer them on, even when they're not doing the right thing. And I wonder, what can we do for early stage, folks in academia? Because we're competing against against veterans like yourself. I certainly do not have that capability to do multiple papers a year at this time. And you talked about it being a numbers game. I probably just have the ability to do one or two a year in terms of papers if I really want to be rigorous. Um, so it looks like the odds are very, very uh, uh, um, negatively stacked against folks that are just starting out. So I guess my question is, what can we do to sort of better the environment, sort of make the environment safer for early stage folks to be a bit more confident to put their work out there. And you sort of said something towards just before I came in earlier. You said something like maybe good enough is good enough, just good is good enough. Are you encouraging just putting things out there just for the sake of just putting out there and playing the numbers game, as you said, given that it's that kind of space we seem to be in? Because I feel a bit I feel a bit like it's I feel like it's a bit um, strange when you use words like, and I get you, it's reality, like, it's arbitrary. The decision making around peer review is arbitrary. We pride ourselves as scientists, about following procedures, protocol, reproducibility. We can rationalize whatever we say we're doing. We always have rationale that is justifiable, but arbitrariness sort of seems at the end of that spectrum. So, lots of thought I've thrown out you right now, but how do we really encourage early career researchers to, in an environment that is welcoming, not as harsh for our group, so to speak? Over. Thank you.
Thanks, Emmanuel. Good question. Let me just clarify, the numbers game one wasn't necessarily you've got to write lots of articles to get through. It's that you can take the same article and have a numbers game with the journals. Energy policy. Oh, okay. Energy. Oh, okay. Energy and climate change, etc. So it wasn't you have to do 10 to get through. It's more of a, if the first journal rejects you, it is a numbers game. Keep trying. If it's a good paper, it'll make it through eventually. So there's also that positive way of don't let the first rejection sting. Try 5 times. And maybe at the 5th time or 6th time, if it's bad and hasn't improved. In terms of this question of mentoring for early career scholars, I mean, I think having a good mentor is really good, and I think you can find them. I think Ryan and Tom actually and Mike seem like very mentoring people. Not that they have time to mentor you, but find the Ryans and Toms and Mikes of your institution and ask your friends and colleagues who those mentors might be. I mean, I've been blessed at each stage of my academic journey, undergrad, master's, PhD. I had 3 phenomenal mentors. They were exceptional. I would not be here without them. And I told them this. I tell them this all the time when I see them. So I think finding a good mentor. 2 is working with colleagues and friends, create communities, like the group here within AAG. But there could be other sorts of groups, postdoc group at your university, or a PhD fellows group at your university, or start a social club. Or like I said, start these rejection Friday beers or dinners, or if you have children, breakfast, lunch at the office. Have a brown bag sandwich lunch once a month where you can just talk to each other. You can also work in teams, Emmanuel. I think one of the things about most PhDs is people feel it's like a lone wolf. You've got to go alone and do it by yourself. But if you can also team up with other people in your department or other people that have intellectual interest for you. I get a request every few days from someone just asking if I want to join them on a paper. Usually I say no. But it's nice to be asked. And sometimes I say yes. And I also wrote, when I was a grad student, people like Amory Lovins and Eleanor Ostrom and David Harvey, if they would write with me, and some wrote back. And I did write with Amory Lovins. He has a chapter in my first book. I was like blown away. He's an energy efficiency guy that I admire. And that's kind of fun. Like, so you never know what other scholars may be willing out there to help you. And the final thing I would suggest, take successful research in your field, whatever it might be, good articles that you read and you're like, man, that is just gold standard. And relook at them, not for the content, but the style. How did that study get designed? What was the title? What was the abstract? How did they choose the keywords? How were the diagrams? How long was the method section? How many references did it have? How long were the case study descriptions? So you're kind of looking at how they engineered the article, and then mimic, don't plagiarize, mimic successful people. For instance, when I was going through grad school, two of the people that I really admired were Thomas Kuhn, E.O. Wilson. Thomas Kuhn is a historian of science, E.O. Wilson, biologist. They wrote awesome, man. I just wished I could write like them. So every time I was writing papers for classes, I was like trying to be like channel my inner E.O. Wilson, channel my inner, Thomas Kuhn. And that helped me. So you can kind of take luminaries in your field that inspire you and try to be like them in terms of the mechanics. All of this implies you're not alone. And you have vast resources, big names in your field, potential mentors on campus, potential scholars to reach out to, potential communities and friends around you that can all help. So I would at least start there. And maybe ask Ryan and Tom and others if the AAG group can also do more to mentor.
Thank you very much. That's useful.
Yeah, I absolutely think that is a huge part of this is creating a culture of support, Emmanuel. And many of us do try to mentor. I think we can do more structured mentoring in our group also. It's something that many of us have talked about in this specialty group of AAG.
Last thing too, and I want to hear from Professor Pasqualetti because I called him out so much. Boston University is very good. Now we are a private, wealthy institution in Boston. We have a postdoc network. There's a union for graduate students. They're actually striking right now for more pay. We have social events almost every day with food and coffee that get people together. And lastly, we also have, get this, Ryan, research on tap. Once a month, we come together to talk about research over beer. Everyone, students are invited. Not that alcohol has to be consumed, but like this, that's the type of environment that's here. You expect students to come, and there are multiple ways that students can identify into different groups. And so, yeah, stuff like that is not that hard to replicate. At least replicate research on tap.